Hello everybody, it's jrobichess. We're going to be taking a look at the Dutch defense in this video. I've had a number of requests for black defenses to the queen's pawn opening, and I wanted to start off with the Dutch defense. Now there's three primary variations of the Dutch defense. One is the Stonewall Variation, which is what we're going to cover in this video. The other is the Leningrad, which is probably a more popular line nowadays than the Stonewall Variation. And then there's the classical Dutch, which is what we'll talk about in a future video as well. But one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about the Stonewall Variation first is because it's the least theory bound out of all the Dutch lines. So in other words, there's not a lot of moves that you have to remember, and the position that we're going to reach is actually very easy to get into. So you shouldn't have any problems whatsoever getting started with the Dutch defense Stonewall Variation and actually achieving the position that we're going to talk about in your games. So the move that's going to start it all off for us here is pawn to f5. Now pawn to f5 in and of itself creates an imbalance in the position very early in the opening. So if you're a kind of a tactical player who likes a dynamic game, this defense is going to fit right at home with you, because although we are kind of opening up the dark square diagonal into the castle position, the kingside castle position of black, the onus is going to be on white to prove that they can make use of that. And the Stonewall Variation makes it very difficult to do so. So it's a very interesting move right out of the opening, pawn to f5. And I, in fact, actually kind of equate this to the Alekhine's defense to the king's pawn opening, in that chances are your opponent doesn't get to play it very often, as often as they would like to be comfortable with the positions that arise. And in fact, a lot of notable grandmasters have made use of the Dutch defense in their chess careers. Botvinnik was the former world chess champion, used it quite a bit. More recently, Kramnik used it a great deal on his rise to chess stardom. He doesn't use it much anymore, but he definitely used it quite a bit and got a lot of wins with it. And other notable grandmasters include Nigel Short, who had a really good performance at Chorus this year. So, the list goes on. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some very common ways to get into the Stonewall Variation of the Dutch. So the next move that's going to be played here is pawn to g3, and we'll take a look at some other ones in a few minutes, but we're going to focus on this one first. Now, the reason why I want to talk about pawn to g3 is because a lot of the modern theory is suggesting that fianchetto by white can help dampen a kingside attack from black. Now, a kingside attack is very common in Dutch lines, especially in the Stonewall Variation, and it often involves a piece sacrifice to unleash some tactics on the opponent. So the modern theory kind of thinks that the fianchetto setup will kind of dampen that possibility for black. But once again, it's going to be, the onus is going to be on white to prove that. So play is going to continue now, knight to f6. Now, knight to f6, you'll probably notice right off the bat that the e4 square here is very firmly under the control of black. We have the pawn attacking this square here on e4. Now we have the knight attacking e4 as well. And the knight is very well placed for a lot of possible jumps to, say, for example, g4 or h5 to unleash a kingside attack. So the knight is very well placed here on f6. Now, I should take a moment to talk a little bit about e5 here, because this is going to be a positional weakness for you all throughout the Dutch Stonewall Variation lines. And most notably, what you're going to see here is probably a knight placed on e5 by white. Now, it doesn't, it's not going to be a game killer when you get a knight here on e5, but it is a weakness. It's a concession that you are going to give the white player. So it's always something that you kind of have to think about and keep in mind as you're working your way into the Stonewall Variation of the Dutch defense and planning your tactical lines and your tactical shots. Because chances are, probably 9 times out of 10, your opponent is going to be able to get a knight here onto e5. But nonetheless, so from this position here, play is going to continue now, bishop to g2, so that bishop is getting ready to make way for that king to castle on the king side. And from here, black is going to play pawn now to e6. So pawn to e6, this is going to be the foundation of our Stonewall position, and it's going to make the black position very solid and almost uncrackable on the queen side, actually, as you'll see as we move forward here. So from this position, white's going to play knight up to f3, and this is usually the culprit that's going to make use of the e5 square. Not always the case, of course, and it might even be a bishop that can come into e5 at some point in the game. But the main thing to remember is that e5 is the eternal weakness that you're going to have to deal with playing the Stonewall Variation of the Dutch defense. So from here now, black's going to play the pawn up now to d5, and you'll notice that the light square diagonals are being completely filled by black, and it's a very solid structure that's going to be pretty much shutting down the light square diagonals access into the black position. That's going to be very important moving forward. So from here now, white's going to play pawn up to c4, black's going to play pawn up to c6, further strengthening and defending the pawn here on d5, and once again solidifying the light square diagonals and putting them firmly in black's control. So from here now, white's going to castle, and black's going to play its bishop up now to d6. And this is the Stonewall variation of the Dutch defense in a nutshell. This is the position that you're going to work towards achieving. Now, interesting enough, if you take a look at the database results, if you add in black's win percentage and the draw percentage, it accounts for over 60% of all of the games played. So it's going to be a fighting game for white out of this position, and white's going to have to play very, very sharply to make sure it doesn't fall towards any kind of sacrifice attacks on the kingside position. Now, of course, that doesn't mean things are all rosy for black. Like we've already talked about the weakness here on e5, but another problem area for black is also the bishop on c8. Black's going to have to work towards getting this bishop, to make it a useful piece in the game. Interestingly enough, though, you'll probably find if you play the Stonewall variation of the Dutch that it's not really a big factor in the beginning of the game, because the bishop is doing something important right now, and that's the defense of the b7 pawn, which makes the queen side even harder for white to crack into. And also, as the game progresses, the bishop can be rerouted, say for example to d7, to e8, up to h5 if you want to. But generally speaking, for a large portion of the game, just sitting on c8 is going to be fine for the bishop, because defending that pawn on b7 is going to be very important, and it's going to kind of prevent white from getting too enthusiastic about trying to crack into the queenside position of black. So that's important to think about as well. Now, I did say at the very beginning that there's a lot of ways that we can achieve this Stonewall position. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip back to the beginning here. So after d4, we're going to go into f5. We're going to take a look at some other variations that can lead into the same kind of position. And they're not hard to get into at all. So after pawn to f5, white could play, for example, c4. I have actually seen this move more than I've seen g3, interestingly enough. Even though, like we talked about, modern theory says that g3 and then the fianchetto will kind of dampen a kingside attack from black, I still see c4 more often. From here, black can still continue to play towards a Stonewall variation, knight to f6 here, and then white will most likely play knight to c3, at which black can now play an immediate d5. Now, if white decides to take this pawn, which usually isn't the move that white will play, you can take back with your knight and have a good game still. But from here, generally, white will play something like pawn to e3, at which point you can now play the foundation of the Stonewall, pawn to e6, and then from here, white can bring the bishop out to d3. So you'll notice here that this is not a fianchetto strategy from white, but rather it's more of a centralization of white's pieces. From here now, we can still continue to play the Stonewall variation by playing pawn up to c6. White can play knight up to e2, and here comes the bishop now to d6. So we're in the same position with just a slightly different move order. But there's another way we can get into the Stonewall structure as well. So for example, after pawn to d4, black can play a mirrored approach by playing pawn to d5. Play could continue something like knight to f3. Black could play now the foundation for the Stonewall pawn structure, pawn to e6, and if white continues now with c4, we can just play an immediate f5, and play would most likely continue as we've discussed in the other lines. So once again, the Stonewall structure is a very interesting structure to play from. I've been doing a little bit of blitz with it as I've been learning about it, and I had a lot of fun with it. And I'm definitely interested in hearing your thoughts and opinions on the Dutch defense, in particular the Stonewall variation. And like I said, in the future videos, we'll also be taking a look at the Leningrad and the classical Dutch lines, and other little things too, like the Staunton gambit. So I'm pretty excited about the Dutch defense. It definitely creates a tactical and unbalanced game right out of the opening. And you know what? White doesn't get a chance to play against it very often. It's not one of the most popular defenses from black, so that can only benefit the black player. So that's basically a general introduction into the Stonewall variation of the Dutch defense. In my next video, I'm going to take a look at some Grandmaster games where attacks were launched from this position, and we'll look at a couple good ones. And we're also going to take a look at a game called the Polish Immortal. And if you want to do a little research on on that before my next video. It's a beautiful, beautiful game in which there was basically black sacrificed all of its minor pieces to achieve the checkmate. And but that's a very extreme example of attacking from the Dutch defense, Stonewall Variation. I'm also going to take a look at some other ones that are much less grandiose, but definitely effective. So take care. Hope you enjoy the video, and we'll see you next time.